Firefighter, normally you'd never be afraid to go into a Type 1 building because they're not combustible, and you would just charge at it and put the fire out. Never in my training were we ever taught that these type of buildings could just collapse in on themselves. There's definitely much more going on than just fire.
The way in which steel-framed buildings behave in fires depends on their construction. In this test, done by British Steel in 1995, a large amount of typical office furniture was burned to see what would happen to the heavy steel beams that supported the ceiling.
When steel is bare, when it heats up, it gets weaker. It's not that it melts in a fire. In fact, normal fires are not hot enough to melt steel. Even if you were, for example, to use an unusual fuel like kerosene, you cannot achieve temperatures hot enough to melt steel. But what happens is it starts to lose its strength. And as it loses its strength, it starts to sag. It becomes softer and sags and can no longer support the load.
This was the largest test of its kind ever conducted. It showed how unprotected steel can be distorted, even by a normal office fire. But as is typical in steel buildings, the structural beams only slowly and progressively warped and sagged. There was no chance of a sudden collapse.
In over 20 years, I have not seen, until recently, a protected steel structure that has collapsed in a fire.
The World Trade Center 7 building reminds me of the Meridian Bank building in some ways in Philadelphia. The Meridian Bank building is a 38-story skyscraper that burned for 18 hours in 1991, suffered extensive damage from the fire, but did not collapse.
I am Dan Barnum, FAIA, a graduate architect from Rice University with a Bachelor of Architecture degree. For the 40-plus years that I've been practicing architecture, I have designed a variety of buildings from small houses to high-rise office buildings. Some of the high-rises that I've worked on are 1 shell and 2 shell here in Houston, and I was project manager for a 22-story office building in Akron, Ohio. I'm a fellow of the American Institute of Architects. I've designed high-rise buildings, and I know what they do in fires because I've studied that. Later in the day, when World Trade Center 7 collapsed, they had already showed us pictures of a few fires in that building, and I mean, they weren't even raging. And how could that cause a building to collapse as if it were imploded? Couldn't happen.
My name is Jonathan Smolens, PE. I'm a professional structural engineer in the Boulder, Denver area for the past 12 years. And one of my specialties is forensic engineering, including evaluation of structures post-disaster. What happened to those columns to all collapse at the same time? The explanation provided does not match the evidence that we have.
My name is Michael Donnelly, PE. I'm a structural engineer with 14 years of experience. I get involved mostly with the design of steel-framed fireproof buildings. We've never had a steel-framed skyscraper collapse in the United States or internationally. So there's no precedent. I don't think Building 7 could have collapsed by fire, as NIST tells us that this collapse mechanism, starting with thermal expansion, that worked its way upward and outward through the building, in a matter of seconds, there's not enough time for the building to collapse the way that NIST tells us it collapsed.
I'm Ed Woniak, licensed fire protection engineer for at least 25 years, and I work for a number of organizations, city, federal, large insurance companies, consultant, always in the area of fire safety, and with the goal of keeping the public safe and first responders safe. I became fascinated with the government's version of the events on 9/11, because this was totally contrary to everything that I've ever experienced, either working in the field of fire safety or knowing what I know about mechanical engineering. It defies many fundamentals of mechanics and materials and physics and just many fundamental engineering concepts.
World Trade Center 7, NIST claims the fires were very large, very hot, and long-lasting, when in reality, observation, which has been researched by many people, shows these fires did not last very long. They were not in the locations where NIST claims they were at given times.
According to lead investigator Shyam Sunder of the National Institute for Standards and Technology, NIST, World Trade Center 7 collapsed at free-fall acceleration for more than 100 feet of its fall. What does the speed of the collapse reveal to us?
Essentially, in less than 7 seconds, Tower 7 came down upon itself.
Building 7, NIST reports admits, fell at the rate of gravity for the first 100 feet. Well, that's impossible unless there's nothing resisting it.
It's just like taking your car keys out and just dropping them. That's how fast the building came down, for over 100 feet. And the only way you can get that is when there's zero resistance. And so what we're looking at is a building just coming straight down, falling right through itself with zero resistance. Buildings don't have zero resistance, which is why you feel comfortable walking into a building.
A building cannot do free fall with a huge steel structural system in place to support it without it being blown up. That's the only way it could come down at free fall.
The failure of all these connections as the primary means of structural failure is inconsistent with a natural gravitational collapse, and indicates the presence of other agents which would dismember these connections.
I'm David Chandler. I have a bachelor's degree in physics from Harvey-Mudd College and a master's in education from Claremont Graduate University and another master's in mathematics from California Polytechnic University. I've been teaching for over 30 years. I'd heard people say, well, it came down at free fall or close to free fall and so forth, so I decided I'd measure it myself. I have a tool that I use in teaching, which allowed me to take a video and put a dot on each frame to follow the motion of things. And so you can measure speeds and accelerations, and it'll do the analysis. One of the fundamental laws of nature is the conservation of energy. In order for it to be falling down with zero resistance, it means that resistance had to have been removed by something else.
And NIST claims that the columns were buckling in the first several seconds before the free fall occurred. Now, I don't see how that's possible.
And in the final report, they modified it, they tried to doctor it up. They still tried to say that it was essentially correct, but then they modified it and they actually admitted there was a period of free fall involved. But they never changed their model. Like, how do you all of a sudden allow for free fall when they just got done explaining how it couldn't have been in free fall? If I were a scientist in this, I'd be embarrassed to try to put forward something like that. It was clearly a fraudulent argument.
In other words, NIST is telling us that the building below it ceased to exist for the first few seconds of the collapse of the building. Well, things in physics just don't cease to exist and cease to resist the forces that are on them.
Free falling for 8 stories. So, we know that happened. Okay, it's been measured and it's on videos. Everyone can see it. NIST has admitted it went into free fall for 8 stories. That's a bothersome part of the puzzle because NIST never explained it.
Absolutely no resistance to the descent whatsoever.
The building didn't disappear so the building can fall for 100 feet at free fall speed. That's impossible. That's a violation of the fundamental law of physics that says that for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. So that evidence alone would indicate that the official story doesn't hold water.
There was no time for this elastic deformation and plastic deformation, which would have absorbed energy and decreased the descent to less than free fall speed. As energy is drained away from the system to deform those members, it would slow down the descending mass and cause a descent at less than free fall speed.
40,000 tons of structural steel in its structural system, and that is intended to keep it from going anywhere. A building cannot do free fall with a huge steel structural system in place to support it.
There's no resistance until the building gets down maybe halfway.
Buildings tend to be delayed as they collapse. They don't just pancake down like this in a very short period of time.
If the pancake theory works, it's going to hit hesitation, and there was no hesitation.
Going from motionless to free fall instantly.
One continuous motion. There couldn't have been any structural resistance.
Buildings just don't behave like that. If floors fall, they tend to fall and are braced by the floor directly beneath it, and there's some delay there.
This is inconsistent with the energy redistribution that would be required from the descending mass to the remaining structure.
Completely impossible. And NIST themselves have to recognize the implications of this. The fact that they haven't is fraudulent.
The connections are designed with a safety factor of 1.5 to 3 times the failure load for the member. So this assures that the member will always fail first in an elastic mode and then a plastic mode.
Ideally, the member would fail before the connection. You don't want the connections to fail first.
The connections failed first without any of the members exhibiting large deformations or deflections. Over 400 connections per second had to fail in order for the members to be released and for the structure to descend at almost free fall rate.
To fail at the rate that they did progressively across the building, even if a floor were to collapse, it still wouldn't be able to collapse all of the connections simultaneously at the rate that it did without secondary explosions.
There's no hesitation. There was no hesitation when it was to hit story after story.
If you were to look at a standard moment frame steel connection, which is a welded connection between the beam and the column, it would take on the order of around 500,000 pounds to shear off one connection. And if you multiply that by 400, put maybe a safety factor of 4, you would require 50 million pounds of force per second in order to collapse the building the way it was shown based on the NIST report and what we saw on the video evidence of the video of the building that day. It's highly unlikely. Don't know how that could ever happen without secondary explosions. It's not logical or reasonable.
The fact that it's coming down at free fall says all of the energy is being used to just make it go straight down, which means it's coming down through itself and not breaking up the building as it goes. Something else has to be clearing the way. And that is smoking gun evidence to me. I think that's one of the primary pieces of evidence that these buildings really were demolished. They weren't just accidents that happened.
We might anticipate that an unevenly damaged building would fall over. Yet, videos of the collapse of Building 7 show a fairly symmetrical fall. How do we make sense of this?
The exterior of the building comes down fully, symmetrically, and at one time. Both sides of the building come down completely. This is fully indicative of full structural support being removed for at least 6 stories. That could not happen by fire.
If there was some fire in one corner, it would have collapsed maybe in that